Sarah is my daughter-in-law, the one who said I make everyone uncomfortable in family photos. Michael is my son, the one who nodded along when she banned me from their wedding anniversary shoot. They thought a divorced veteran living in a small apartment had no say in family memories. They forgot I built the empire that captures those memories for half the families in this state. All right, before we dive into this story of family hierarchy and hidden power, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. I spent 22 years serving my country, but apparently that doesn't earn you a place in your own family's photo albums. The rejection hit different than incoming artillery ever did. I was sitting in my compact living room, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. The message was clinical, efficient, the way she handled everything that involved me. Margaret, we've decided to keep this year's family portraits intimate, just immediate family. Hope you understand. I stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the cursor blink after her name. Immediate family. 22 years in the Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Bronze Star gathering dust in my bedroom drawer, and I wasn't immediate family. My son Michael had emerged from my body, spent 18 years under my roof, called me when his first girlfriend broke his heart, and I wasn't immediate family. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with their neutral beige paint and generic artwork that came with the furnished rental. Everything about this place screamed temporary, transitional, like I was just passing through my own life. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I sat, surrounded by the humble trappings of someone who appeared to have little, while my phone contained contacts that could shake the photography industry from coast to coast. Sarah had orchestrated this exclusion, with the precision of a military operation, though she'd never worn a uniform a day in her life. The family group chat had been buzzing for weeks about the anniversary shoot, about matching outfits and location scouting, about whether little Emma needed her hair trimmed before the session. I'd watched it all unfold from the sidelines, occasionally offering suggestions that were met with polite acknowledgments and swift subject changes. "We're thinking Riverside Gardens for the backdrop," Michael had written, and I'd mentioned that the lighting there was tricky in late afternoon. That morning shoots worked better with the natural shadows. Sarah had responded with a thumbs up emoji and immediately pivoted to discussing wardrobe coordination. It was like watching a conversation through bulletproof glass, seeing the interaction but unable to truly participate. The exclusion had been building for months, maybe years, little moments of dismissal that accumulated like sand in an hourglass. Sarah redirecting conversations when I shared stories from my service. The way she'd glance at her phone when I talked about my work, whatever she assumed my work was. The subtle but unmistakable message that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, that I was a relic from Michael's past rather than a vital part of his present. I'd made the mistake of mentioning to Michael that I felt sidelined during family gatherings, that Sarah seemed to view me as an inconvenience rather than a grandmother to their daughter Emma. His response had been swift and predictable. "Mom, Sarah's just particular about family dynamics. She grew up differently than we did. You have to understand her perspective." Understanding her perspective. As if my 2 decades of military service, including intelligence work that required reading people and situations with life or death accuracy, hadn't taught me exactly what Sarah's perspective was. She saw me as the embarrassing mother-in-law who lived in a modest apartment, drove a 10-year-old Honda, and whose greatest achievement was apparently surviving long enough to become an inconvenience. The photography session was scheduled for the following Saturday at Prestige Portrait Studios, the flagship location of what had become the most successful photography chain in the state. Sarah had chosen them specifically, she'd mentioned in the group chat, because they understand upscale family portraiture and work with the kind of clientele who appreciate quality. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with my old field knife. Prestige Portrait Studios, 27 locations across 3 states, annual revenue pushing $40 million, a client roster that included senators, celebrities, and the kind of old money families who considered Sarah's social climbing attempts quaint, and Sarah had no idea that the woman she'd just excluded from family photos owned every single lens, light, and square foot of studio space in the empire she was so eager to impress. I'd built prestige from nothing, starting with a single camera and a spare bedroom converted into a makeshift studio. Those early days after my military discharge, when civilian life felt like learning to walk on alien terrain, photography had been my anchor. The technical precision reminded me of intelligence, work, the attention to detail, the ability to capture truth in a single frame. What started as therapy became passion, and passion became business. The first studio opened in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation office. I'd used my VA benefits and military savings to cover the initial investment, working 18-hour days to build a client base from scratch. The military had taught me discipline, logistics, and leadership. But it had also taught me something Sarah would never understand: how to be underestimated and use that to your advantage. While other studio owners focused on flashy marketing and social media presence, I'd focused on systems, quality, and strategic expansion. I'd studied market gaps, identified underserved demographics, and built a business model that prioritized both accessibility and excellence. The military had taught me that the most effective operations were often the ones that looked simple on the surface but were built on complex, invisible infrastructure. By year 3, I had 5 locations. By year 7, 15. The business grew not through flashy advertising but through word-of-mouth referrals from clients who appreciated consistency, professionalism, and results. I'd hired the best photographers money could attract, invested in cutting-edge equipment before competitors even knew it existed, and created a training program that turned talented artists into business assets. The success had been steady rather than spectacular, which suited me perfectly. I'd learned in the military that the most dangerous operations were often the quietest ones, that power exercised subtly was power exercised effectively. While my competitors fought public battles over market share and social media followers, I'd been systematically acquiring real estate, locking in exclusive supplier contracts, and building relationships with venues and event planners that created natural referral pipelines. Sarah knew none of this. To her, I was Margaret Patterson, divorced veteran, Social Security recipient, apartment dweller. She saw the surface and assumed she was seeing the whole picture. In her world, success was about display, about visible markers of achievement that could be photographed and shared and envied. She couldn't conceive of success that preferred anonymity, that found power in privacy rather than publicity. The decision to keep my business ownership quiet hadn't been strategic initially. It had been protective. The military had taught me that information was a weapon, and weapons were most effective when your opponents didn't know you possessed them. I'd also seen too many relationships change when money entered the equation. Too many people who suddenly discovered familial affection when they learned about financial assets. Michael knew I worked in photography, but he assumed I was an employee, somewhere, maybe a part-time instructor or assistant. I'd never corrected his assumption, partly because he'd never asked for details, and partly because his lack of curiosity told me everything I needed to know about how much he valued my life, beyond his immediate needs. If my own son couldn't be bothered to understand what I'd built, why would his wife take an interest? The text from Sarah sat on my phone like a small bomb, its implications expanding with each reading. Keep this year's family portraits intimate. Just immediate family. The words were chosen carefully, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. If I objected, I'd be the unreasonable one, the difficult mother-in-law who couldn't respect boundaries. If I accepted it quietly, I'd be confirming their assessment that I was disposable. I'd faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, sat through briefings, where lives hung on split-second decisions, been responsible for intelligence that affected entire operations. But nothing had prepared me for the particular cruelty of family rejection wrapped in polite language. The military had taught me about honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. It hadn't prepared me for people who shared your blood but not your values. Emma, my granddaughter, was 7 years old and had never known a world where Grandma Margaret wasn't part of family photos. Those pictures lived on Sarah's carefully curated social media accounts, in frames throughout their house, in albums that would someday tell Emma the story of her childhood. And now that story would have a gap, an absence that Emma might not notice immediately, but would certainly question eventually. The cruelty wasn't just in the exclusion itself, but in the timing. Sarah had waited until the session was already booked, already planned, already anticipated by Emma, before delivering the news. It was psychological warfare disguised as family, planning, designed to maximize hurt while minimizing her own culpability. If confronted, she could claim it was a last-minute decision, a space limitation, a misunderstanding. I set the phone down and walked to my bedroom closet, pushing aside the civilian clothes that had become my daily uniform. In the back, behind winter coats and forgotten formal wear, hung my dress blue uniform. 22 years of service, compressed into fabric and insignia. The bronze star was in a box on the shelf above, along with commendation letters and photos from deployments that had shaped me in ways Sarah would never comprehend. But it wasn't the military credentials that mattered now. It was what I'd built after the uniform came off, what I'd created with the discipline and strategic thinking the service had instilled in me. Sarah thought she was excluding a powerless woman from a family photo. She had no idea she was about to discover exactly how much power she'd been taking for granted. The phone buzzed again. Michael this time. "Mom, I hope you understand. Sarah just wants something special for our anniversary. Maybe we can do a separate grandmother session with Emma sometime." A separate session, a consolation prize, like I was a participation trophy, rather than the woman who'd raised him, who'd been present for every milestone Sarah was now trying to erase from family history. I typed back a single word. Sure. Let them think I was accepting defeat. Let them believe their assessment of my powerlessness was accurate. In intelligence work, we'd called it seeming weak when you are strong. The enemy's misconceptions about your capabilities were often your greatest strategic advantage. The Prestige Portrait Studio's flagship location was booked solid for the next 3 months. Celebrity clients, political families, society weddings, corporate headshots that would grace annual reports and boardroom walls. Sarah had somehow managed to secure a Saturday afternoon slot during peak wedding season, which should have told her something about the kind of influence required to make that happen. But Sarah saw what she wanted to see, which was a convenient appointment time rather than evidence of institutional power. I opened my laptop, the same military-grade encrypted machine I'd used for business communications since day one. The Prestige. Portal, our internal management system, loaded with familiar efficiency. 27 locations, each one showing real-time booking status, photographer schedules, and revenue tracking. The flagship location glowed green on the map, fully operational and preparing for another profitable weekend. The photographer assigned to Sarah's session was Marcus Chen, one of our most skilled artists and a former Navy photographer who understood both technical excellence and client service. Marcus had no idea he'd be photographing the family of his ultimate boss, which was exactly how I preferred to operate. The best leaders, I'd learned in the military, were often invisible to the people they led until their leadership was needed. Sarah's appointment was locked in for 2 p.m. Saturday, prime time for the golden hour lighting that made every subject look their absolute best. She'd booked the premium package, complete with wardrobe consultation, multiple background options, and professional retouching. The kind of service that cost more than most people's monthly rent, paid for with the casual confidence of someone who assumed money would always be available for the things she deemed important. The irony was delicious. Sarah was about to pay premium prices to a company I owned to exclude me from photos that would be taken by equipment I'd purchased in a studio space I'd designed, under lighting systems I'd personally approved. She'd driven herself to the flagship location of my empire to celebrate the family she'd decided I wasn't worthy to be part of. But the real revelation was still coming. Sarah had no idea that tomorrow's photo session was about to become a master class in the difference between assumed power and actual power, between social positioning and real authority. She'd spent months positioning herself as the gatekeeper of family inclusion, never realizing she was about to meet the woman who owned the gate. The phone buzzed one more time. Emma, texting from Michael's phone with the careful spelling of a 7-year-old learning to communicate. "Grandma Margaret, are you coming to take pictures with us tomorrow? Mommy said maybe not, but I want you there." The innocence in those words, the unfiltered honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned that love could be conditional and family could be selective. I typed back carefully. "We'll see, sweetheart. Grandma has some surprises planned." And I did. 27 locations worth of surprises. $40 million worth of surprises. A lifetime of military training and business building worth of surprises. Sarah thought she was orchestrating a family photo session. She was actually walking into a lesson about the difference between apparent weakness and hidden strength. The evening stretched ahead of me, quiet and full of potential. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would reshape family dynamics and challenge assumptions that had been building for years. Sarah had made the mistake of confusing my discretion for weakness, my privacy for powerlessness. She was about to learn that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who looked defeated before the battle even began. The morning light filtered through my apartment's single-bedroom window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. That had seen better decades. I'd been awake since 0500 hours, old habits dying hard even 15 years after my discharge. The coffee was strong and black, the way we'd made it in forward operating bases when sugar and cream were luxuries we couldn't afford. Some traditions were worth maintaining, especially when you needed clarity for the day ahead. My phone showed 17 missed calls from unknown numbers, which meant the photography industry grapevine was already buzzing about something. In this, business news traveled faster than light through fiber optic cables, and gossip moved even quicker. I'd built prestige portrait studios on the foundation of discretion and professionalism, but that didn't mean my competitors weren't constantly trying to peer behind the curtain of our success. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman who'd learned to hide her achievements behind carefully cultivated ordinariness, gray streaks in brown hair that I'd stopped dyeing years ago, not from financial necessity, but from strategic choice. Laugh lines around eyes that had seen combat zones and corporate boardrooms with equal intensity, the kind of face that blended into crowds, that people underestimated, that carried authority without announcing it to the world. Sarah would be waking up in her McMansion about now, probably already planning her outfit for the afternoon's photo session. She'd choose something expensive but understated, the kind of calculated casual that screamed designer labels while pretending to be effortless. Her morning routine would include checking social media for inspiration, maybe scrolling through lifestyle blogs to ensure her aesthetic choices aligned with current trends. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Here I sat in a modest apartment, wearing pajamas that had seen better years, while the woman who'd excluded me from family photos prepared to spend a fortune at my own business. Sarah lived in a world where appearance equaled reality, where visible success was the only success that mattered. She'd never understand the military mindset that valued substance over show, results over recognition. My laptop chimed with the morning business reports from each prestige location. Revenue streams, booking percentages, client satisfaction scores, equipment maintenance schedules, the kind of detailed operational data that most business owners reviewed weekly, but I examined daily. Military training had taught me that situational awareness was survival, and in business, survival meant staying ahead of every variable that could affect performance. The flagship location was operating at 97% capacity this weekend, with bookings extending into the following spring. Marcus Chen had already confirmed his readiness for the afternoon session. noting in his report that the clients had specifically requested upscale treatment befitting their social status. The phrase made me smile. Sarah's language, filtered. Through Marcus's professional translation, Emma had texted again from Michael's phone, this time with a photo of the dress she'd chosen for the session. Pink with white flowers, age-appropriate and adorable, the kind of outfit that would photograph beautifully under studio lighting. Her message included a string of heart emojis and the words, "I picked this for you too, Grandma Margaret, even if you can't come." The innocence of childhood, untainted by adult politics and social maneuvering. My granddaughter had no idea she was caught in the middle of a power struggle that had been building for years. To Emma, family was simple. People who loved you showed up for important moments. She couldn't understand why Grandma Margaret, who'd never missed a birthday or school play or soccer game, wouldn't be included in something as basic as a family photo. In her 7-year-old logic, love equaled presence, and absence equaled abandonment. The irony was that Emma's understanding was more sophisticated than her parents'. She'd grasped the fundamental truth that Sarah and Michael had lost somewhere in their climb toward social respectability. Family wasn't about curated image management or strategic exclusions. It was about consistency, loyalty, and showing up when showing up mattered. Emma knew that Grandma Margaret always showed up. I'd been showing up for this family long before Sarah entered the picture. Through Michael's teenage rebellions, his college struggles, his first heartbreak, his career uncertainties, I'd been the steady presence while he figured out who he wanted to become, the reliable support system that never demanded credit or recognition. The foundation he'd built his adult life on, even if he no longer remembered who'd laid the groundwork. Sarah saw my history with Michael as competition rather than resource. She couldn't understand that a strong relationship with his mother would actually strengthen their marriage, that secure family connections created stability rather than division. Her own family background was shallow but dramatic, full of surface-level conflicts and attention-seeking behaviors that masqueraded as closeness. She mistook chaos for intimacy and assumed everyone else operated from the same playbook. The business. Reports showed that 3 of our competitors had lost major clients this month, probably to prestige locations. Market share was a zero-sum game in luxury photography, and our combination of technical excellence and strategic positioning was gradually eliminating competition, not through aggressive tactics or price wars, but through consistent superior service that created client loyalty strong enough to withstand poaching attempts. That loyalty was built on relationships that went deeper than transactional exchanges. Our photographers weren't just skilled technicians, they were storytellers who understood that family portraits were historical documents, visual legacies that would outlive everyone in the frame. They approached each session with the gravity that responsibility demanded, treating every client's memories with the respect they deserved. Sarah would receive that level of service this afternoon, never knowing that the woman she'd excluded from the photos had personally trained every photographer in the prestige system. The lighting techniques, the posing strategies, the post-production standards that would make her family look flawless were all methods I'd developed and refined over decades of business operation. She'd benefit from my expertise while denying my existence. The morning news was running a feature about successful women entrepreneurs in the photography industry, complete with statistics about female business ownership and market penetration. The reporter interviewed several studio owners who'd built successful regional operations, praising their innovation and determination. Prestige Portrait Studios was mentioned as an industry leader, but the segment focused on our photographers and client services rather than ownership structure. Perfect. The less public attention on my role, the better. I'd learned in intelligence, work that the most effective operations were the ones nobody talked about, the successes that remained invisible until their results became undeniable. Sarah would never think to Google Prestige Portrait Studios owner because she assumed that anyone with real power would make that power visible and public. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, what are you up to today? Sarah mentioned you seemed upset about the photo thing." The casual dismissal embedded in the photo thing was characteristic of how they both minimized anything that didn't serve their immediate interests. 22 years of military service, 2 decades of business building, a lifetime of showing up for family obligations, reduced to the photo thing. I typed back, "Just working on some photography projects. Have fun at your session." Let him wonder what kind of photography projects a supposedly unemployed apartment-dwelling veteran could be working on. His lack of curiosity about my life would become a liability soon enough. The truth was that Michael had stopped seeing me as a complete person years ago. I'd become a character in his personal narrative, the devoted mother who'd sacrificed everything for his success, and now existed primarily to validate his achievements and provide convenient grandparent services. He'd never asked about my post-military career, my business interests, my financial situation, or my long-term plans. I was background scenery in his life story. Sarah had encouraged this dynamic because it served her purposes. The less Michael knew about my actual capabilities and resources, the easier it became for her to position me as dependent rather than independent, needy rather than self-sufficient. She'd systematically worked to minimize my role in family discussions, always steering conversations away from my experiences and toward topics where she could dominate. The morning's email brought contract renewals from 3 major venue partnerships, exclusive arrangements that gave prestige photographers preferred access to high-end wedding and event locations. These partnerships were worth millions in annual revenue and had taken years to negotiate, requiring relationship building, reputation management, and strategic positioning that most competitors couldn't match. The venues trusted prestige because we delivered consistent quality without drama or complications. Sarah would never understand the complexity behind those simple partnerships. She lived in a world where connections were about social networking and surface-level charm, where relationships were maintained through carefully curated social media interactions rather than reliable professional performance. She couldn't conceive of business relationships that were built on mutual respect and shared standards rather than personal charisma. The contrast between our approaches to relationship building was about to become very relevant. Sarah had built her family influence through manipulation and exclusion, creating artificial scarcity around her approval to increase its perceived value. She'd positioned herself as the gatekeeper of family harmony, the person who decided who belonged and who didn't. It was a classic power play that worked only as long as everyone accepted her authority to make those decisions. But Sarah had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that her power within the family structure was absolute, that her ability to exclude me from photos was indicative of broader authority over family dynamics. She'd confused tactical success with strategic dominance, winning individual battles while failing to understand the larger war she'd initiated. Military training had taught me to think in terms of campaign strategy rather than individual engagements. You could lose every battle and still win the war if your overall positioning was superior. Sarah had been winning battles for years, gradually eroding my visible role in family functions while increasing her own centrality. But she'd been fighting the wrong war entirely. The real battle wasn't about social positioning or family hierarchy. It was about respect, recognition, and the fundamental question of what constituted family loyalty. Sarah had made family membership conditional on her approval, creating a system where love had to be earned through compliance with her preferences. That approach worked only if everyone involved accepted the terms of engagement. I'd never accepted those terms. I'd simply been waiting for the right moment to make my position clear. Sarah had provided that moment by going too far, by crossing a line that revealed the true nature of her intentions. Excluding me from family photos wasn't about space limitations or artistic vision. It was about erasing my presence from family history, literally removing me from the visual record of Emma's childhood. That level of calculated cruelty required a proportional response. Not revenge, which was emotionally satisfying but strategically limited, but correction. Sarah needed to understand the difference between apparent power and actual power, between social maneuvering and real authority. She was about to receive an education in both. The afternoon would bring revelations that would reshape family dynamics permanently. Sarah would walk into prestige portrait studios as the confident orchestrator of family exclusion and walk out understanding exactly how little she'd known about the woman she'd been systematically underestimating. The lesson would be memorable, comprehensive, and impossible to ignore. My phone showed one final message from Emma. "Grandma Margaret, I love you, even if you can't be in our pictures today." The pure heart of a child who understood family loyalty, better than the adults supposedly guiding her development. Emma would learn today that sometimes the people who seem powerless are simply choosing not to exercise the power they possess. The shower water ran hot enough to fog the bathroom mirror, steam rising like morning mist over a battlefield. I'd always done my best thinking under scalding water, a habit formed during those brief moments of privacy in military barracks when you could let your guard down and process the day's intelligence. This morning required that kind of clarity, the mental preparation that separated successful operations from disasters born of emotional reaction. 27 years ago, I'd stepped off a Greyhound bus in downtown Phoenix with 2 duffel bags, a modest savings account, and a head full of technical skills the civilian world didn't quite know how to value. Fresh out of the Army, discharged, with honors but no clear direction, I'd felt like an astronaut trying to readjust to Earth's gravity. The military had given me structure, purpose, and identity for over 2 decades. Civilian life felt like improvisation after years of precision. Choreography. The apartment I'd found was similar to this one, small and unremarkable, chosen for function rather than form. The landlord had been impressed by my military record and steady references, but I could see the questions in his eyes. What did a former intelligence specialist plan to do in a city where defense contractors were scarce and civilian applications? For my skills weren't immediately obvious? I hadn't known the answer myself at the time. Photography had started as therapy, a way to impose order on a world that suddenly felt chaotic and unpredictable. The camera gave me control over light, composition, timing, all variables that could be measured and adjusted until they achieved the desired result. It reminded me of intelligence analysis, the patient process of gathering information, identifying patterns, and drawing conclusions that others might miss. Both disciplines required seeing what was actually there rather than what you expected to see. The first camera was a used Canon I'd bought from a pawn shop, heavy and mechanical, the kind of equipment that demanded respect rather than convenience. I'd spent hours reading technical manuals, understanding the relationship between aperture and shutter speed, learning how different lenses affected perspective and depth of field. The precision appealed to me, the way small adjustments could create dramatically different results. Those early experiments had been purely personal, attempts to document the desert landscape around Phoenix in ways that captured both its harsh beauty and subtle complexity. I'd drive out before dawn to catch the light as it painted the mountains, staying until sunset to observe how shadows transformed familiar terrain into something alien and magnificent. The desert taught patience, the understanding that the best shots required waiting for conditions to align perfectly. The transition from hobby to business had been gradual, almost accidental. A neighbor had seen some of my landscape prints and asked if I'd photograph her daughter's graduation party. The session had gone well enough that she'd recommended me to friends who'd hired me for their family portraits. Word spread through the kind of organic networking that no marketing budget could buy, built on results rather than promises. Those first-paying clients had been forgiving of my inexperience with people photography, patient with my military-style direct communication that hadn't yet learned to soften technical critique with social pleasantries. They'd appreciated my attention to detail, my insistence on getting the shot right rather than settling for good. Enough. Quality became my reputation before I'd even decided to pursue photography as a career. The business had grown organically, driven by referrals and repeat customers who valued consistency over flash. I'd reinvested every dollar of profit into better equipment, better studio space, better training. The military had taught me that excellence was a process rather than an accident, that superior results came from superior preparation and systematic improvement. I'd applied those principles to photography with the same intensity I'd once brought to intelligence work. Michael had been born during those early entrepreneurial years, when 12-hour workdays were standard and financial security was still a distant goal rather than present reality. His father, David, had been supportive initially, proud of my transition from military service to small business ownership. But the demands of building a photography business had strained our marriage in ways that neither of us had anticipated or knew how to address. David had wanted a traditional military wife who would transition smoothly into being a traditional civilian wife, focused primarily on home and family while he pursued his own career ambitions. He'd supported my photography as a hobby, but grew increasingly uncomfortable as it became a serious business venture that required travel, evening shoots, and weekend commitments. The success that I'd worked so hard to achieve became a source of conflict rather than celebration. The divorce had been civil but painful, complicated by custody arrangements and financial settlements that reflected two people who'd grown in different directions despite their best intentions. Michael had been 12, old enough to understand that his parents' marriage was ending but too young to grasp the complex dynamics that had led to that conclusion. I'd tried to shield him from the details while being honest about the basic facts. Raising Michael as a single mother while building a photography business had required organizational skills that made military logistics look simple by comparison. School schedules, client appointments, equipment maintenance, accounting, marketing, all had to be balanced while ensuring that Michael felt loved, supported, and prioritized. I'd learned to compartmentalize with surgical precision, giving each aspect of my life the attention it deserved without allowing any one area to overwhelm the others. Those years had forged my understanding of what real strength looked like. Not the theatrical displays of dominance that some people mistook for power, but the quiet competence that kept multiple complex systems functioning simultaneously. Michael had grown up watching me solve problems through careful analysis rather than emotional reaction, seeing me build something substantial through patient work rather than dramatic gestures. The first prestige portrait studio had opened when Michael was 15, old enough to understand that his mother was creating something significant, but still young enough to take that success for granted. He'd helped with basic tasks during school breaks, organizing files and cleaning equipment, earning spending money while learning about business operations. I'd hoped the experience would teach him about work ethic and delayed gratification. Michael had been popular in high school, naturally charismatic in ways that I'd never been. He'd inherited his father's social ease but combined it with my strategic thinking, a combination that made him effective in group settings and leadership roles. I'd been proud of his achievements while worrying that success came too easily for him, that he might never develop the resilience that comes from overcoming significant obstacles. College had been expensive, but manageable, thanks to the growing success of prestige portrait studios. Michael had chosen business administration, a practical major that would provide career flexibility while building on skills he'd observed in my entrepreneurial journey. I'd encouraged him to find his own path while secretly hoping he might eventually join the family business and help expand our operations. That hope had faded during his senior year when he'd met Sarah at a fraternity mixer. She'd been everything I wasn't: socially connected, aesthetically focused, comfortable with attention and admiration. Michael had been immediately smitten with her confidence and style, drawn to someone who seemed to navigate social situations with the same ease he brought to academic and professional challenges. Sarah had been polite during our early meetings, correctly assessing that open conflict with Michael's mother would be counterproductive. She'd asked appropriate questions about my business, complimented my work, and expressed interest in photography as an art form. The performance had been convincing enough that I'd initially been optimistic about welcoming her into our small Family. The shift had been gradual, but unmistakable. Sarah had begun steering conversations away from topics where I had expertise, redirecting Michael's attention toward activities and interests that didn't include me. She'd suggested alternative plans when I'd proposed family outings, always with reasonable explanations that made objections seem petty. The exclusion had been systematic but deniable, professional-grade manipulation disguised as natural preference. Michael had been oblivious to the pattern, interpreting Sarah's behavior as normal relationship building rather than territorial acquisition. He'd never experienced manipulative social dynamics, having grown up in an environment where direct communication was valued over strategic positioning. Sarah's approach was foreign to his experience, sophisticated enough that he didn't recognize it as deliberate strategy. The engagement had been announced at a restaurant dinner where I'd been seated at the opposite end of the table from the happy couple, close enough to participate in toasts but too far away for private conversation. Sarah had worn my grandmother's ring, a family heirloom that Michael had retrieved from my jewelry box without asking permission. The symbolism hadn't been accidental. She was claiming not just Michael, but the family history that came with him. Their wedding had been elegant and expensive, funded largely by my business success, though that contribution had been carefully minimized in public discussions. Sarah had wanted a destination ceremony that would naturally limit attendance to their closest friends and most important family members. I'd been included but positioned as a supporting character rather than the mother of the groom, my role, reduced to writing checks while Sarah orchestrated the celebration of their union. The afternoon was advancing toward the moment of revelation, bringing Sarah closer to an education she hadn't requested, but desperately needed. She was probably at the salon right now, getting the kind of professional styling that would complement her carefully chosen outfit and create the perfect visual narrative for social media sharing. Every detail had been planned to support the image of family success and happiness she wanted to project. Sarah's approach to family management was essentially a branding exercise, with herself as creative director and everyone else as supporting cast members whose roles could be expanded or eliminated based on their contribution to the overall aesthetic. She'd reduced family relationships to content creation, measuring love and loyalty by their photogenic potential rather than their emotional authenticity. The irony was that Sarah's obsession with image control had led her to make a strategic error that would undermine everything she'd worked to achieve. By excluding me from the photo session, she'd created a story that was more interesting than the one she'd intended to tell. The narrative of family exclusion and hidden power would generate far more attention than another set of perfectly staged family portraits. My laptop chimed with an email from the Prestige corporate office, a routine weekly report summarizing customer satisfaction scores, revenue projections, and operational efficiency metrics across all 27 locations. The numbers were strong, reflecting the consistent quality that had made Prestige the dominant player in upscale family photography. Our client retention rate exceeded 90%, with most families returning for annual sessions and referring friends and relatives at rates that made traditional advertising almost unnecessary. The success had been built on understanding what clients actually wanted versus what they claimed to want. Most people said they wanted natural, candid photos that captured authentic family moments. But what they actually purchased were carefully composed portraits that made them look more attractive, more successful, and more harmonious than they typically appeared in real life. The art was in creating images that felt natural while being thoroughly constructed. Sarah would receive exactly that kind of service this afternoon, benefiting from techniques and technologies I'd spent years developing and refining. The lighting, systems that would make her skin look flawless, were custom designed for Prestige studios. The posing strategies that would create the illusion of genuine family warmth were methods I'd personally trained every photographer to implement. The post-production work that would eliminate any visual imperfections was performed using software and protocols I'd developed specifically for family portraiture. She'd walk away with photos that exceeded her expectations while having no idea that the woman she'd excluded from those photos had created every aspect of the experience she'd just enjoyed. The disconnect between perception and reality was so complete that it felt like performance art, a live demonstration of how thoroughly someone could misunderstand the forces shaping their own experience. The business reports also showed that our main competitor, Sterling Studios, had lost another major venue contract this month, their third significant account defection in 6 months. Market consolidation was accelerating as clients increasingly chose providers with proven track records over newcomers with lower prices but inconsistent results. The photography industry was becoming more competitive, which paradoxically made established quality providers more valuable rather than less. Prestige's market position was stronger than ever, built on relationships and reputation that couldn't be easily replicated or undermined. We'd become the default choice for families who wanted premium results without the risk of disappointment, the safe bet that delivered predictable excellence rather than variable outcomes. That consistency was worth premium pricing to clients, who understood that family memories couldn't be reshot if the first attempt failed. Sarah had chosen Prestige for exactly those reasons, drawn by our reputation for handling high-profile clients with discretion and skill. She'd researched our portfolio, read our reviews, and selected us over competitors because she wanted the security that came with proven expertise. The decision had been logical and well-informed, based on exactly the kind of careful analysis that should have made her question her assumptions about other areas where her information might be incomplete. But cognitive bias was powerful, especially when it served emotional needs. Sarah needed to believe that I was powerless and dependent, that her position in the family hierarchy was secure and unassailable. Acknowledging that I might possess resources or capabilities she didn't understand would have threatened the narrative she'd constructed about family dynamics and her own importance within those relationships. The afternoon appointment was less than 3 hours away, bringing the moment of truth closer with each passing minute. Sarah would arrive at Prestige Portrait Studios, confident in her ability to control family narratives and relationships, expecting to add another successful manipulation to her collection of strategic victories. She had no idea that she was walking into a situation where all her assumptions would be challenged and her understanding of family power dynamics would be permanently altered. Marcus would greet her professionally, as he greeted all clients, treating her with the respect and courtesy that Prestige was known for providing. He'd guide her family through the session with the skill that had made him one of our most successful photographers, creating beautiful images that met or exceeded their expectations. Nothing about the experience would seem unusual or complicated from a client service perspective. But the revelation would come, as revelations always did in my experience, at the moment when it would have maximum impact and educational value. Sarah would learn that her assumptions about power and powerlessness had been fundamentally flawed, that her strategic manipulations had been observed and analyzed by someone with far more resources and influence than she'd ever imagined. The lesson would be comprehensive and memorable, delivered with the same systematic thoroughness I'd once brought to intelligence briefings and business presentations. Sarah had spent years teaching me about exclusion and dismissal. This afternoon, I would teach her about the difference between apparent weakness and hidden strength, between social positioning and actual authority. The phone showed one final message from Michael sent an hour ago. "Mom, Sarah says you seemed fine with missing the photos. I'm glad you're being understanding about this. We'll plan something with just you and Emma soon." The casual dismissal of my feelings, the assumption that my acceptance was genuine rather than strategic, revealed exactly how little my son understood about the woman who'd raised him. Michael would learn today that understanding and acceptance weren't the same thing, that strategic patience wasn't the same as passive submission. He'd discover that his mother possessed resources and capabilities he'd never bothered to investigate, that his assumptions about family dynamics had been as flawed as his wife's. The education would be uncomfortable but necessary, delivered, with the love of a mother who refused to let her son continue making such fundamental errors in judgment. The clock on my kitchen wall showed 1:15 p.m. when my phone rang with Marcus Chen's number displayed on the screen. He never called during active sessions unless something unusual was developing, which meant Sarah's family photo appointment was about to become more interesting than anyone had anticipated. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Mrs. Patterson, the Pembroke family has arrived early and they're making quite an impression." Marcus's tone carried the diplomatic restraint he'd perfected during years of managing high-maintenance clients. "The primary contact, Mrs. Sarah Pembroke, has some very specific ideas about how this session should proceed, and she's been quite vocal about her expectations." Through the phone, I could hear the familiar sounds of the flagship studio in operation, equipment being adjusted, soft background music, the gentle hum of professional lighting systems warming up. But underneath those routine sounds was something else, a tension that suggested this wasn't going to be a standard family portrait session. "What specific concerns has Mrs. Pembroke raised?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Sarah had probably arrived with a detailed list of requirements and expectations, treating Marcus like service staff rather than the accomplished professional photographer he was. She'd be performing her version of sophisticated clientele behavior, unaware that her approach revealed more about her insecurities than her status. Marcus paused diplomatically. "She's brought printed examples of poses she wants to recreate, specific lighting requests that suggest she's done considerable research, and she's been very clear about wanting to review every shot before we move to the next setup. She also asked about our policy regarding family members who might arrive unexpectedly and want to join the session." Emma's birth had temporarily softened the family dynamics, creating shared focus on the new baby that transcended previous conflicts. I'd been a devoted grandmother from day one, providing practical support during those exhausting early months, while being careful not to overstep boundaries that Sarah had clearly established. The balance had been delicate but manageable, based on my willingness to accept secondary status in exchange for access to my granddaughter. That compromise had worked for 7 years, with me gradually accepting diminished influence in exchange for continued family involvement. I'd learned to navigate Sarah's preferences, to phrase suggestions as questions, to make my presence useful rather than threatening. The strategy had been successful in maintaining family relationships while slowly eroding my own sense of authority and dignity. The photography session exclusion had finally crossed a line that couldn't be rationalized or accepted. This wasn't about social preferences or personality conflicts. It was about family legacy, about Emma's future understanding of her own history. Sarah was literally trying to erase me from the visual record of my granddaughter's childhood, creating an official family narrative that deleted my existence and contributions. The insult was particularly sharp because of the photography connection. Sarah had chosen to exclude me from family photos using the industry I'd built, paying premium prices to my own company for the privilege of denying my family membership. The irony was so complete, it felt like cosmic justice waiting to unfold. The universe aligning to teach Sarah about the difference between appearance and reality. Michael's complicity in the exclusion had been the final revelation I'd needed about where family loyalties actually lay. His willingness to support Sarah's decision, to minimize my hurt feelings as unreasonable sensitivity, had shown me exactly how much my decades of sacrifice and support had actually meant to him. The knowledge was painful but clarifying, stripping away illusions I'd been maintaining about unconditional family bonds. The time for diplomatic compromises and strategic patience had ended. Sarah had escalated the conflict beyond the point where quiet acceptance was possible or dignified. She'd made family membership conditional on her approval, creating a system where my relationship with Emma depended on Sarah's willingness to grant access. That level of control required correction through education rather than negotiation. The morning was advancing toward afternoon, bringing the moment of revelation closer with each passing hour. Sarah would arrive at Prestige Portrait Studios expecting to orchestrate another successful family exclusion, confident in her ability to control family narratives and relationships. She had no idea that she was walking into a master class on actual power versus assumed authority, delivered by the woman she'd consistently underestimated. The call came at 11:47 a.m., just as I was reviewing the final equipment checklist for the flagship studio. Marcus Chen's voice carried the professional calm that made him one of our most requested photographers, but I could detect the underlying tension that came with high-stakes client sessions. "Mrs. Patterson, I wanted to confirm the VIP treatment. For this afternoon's booking, the client specifically mentioned they expect white glove service and premium positioning." I almost smiled at the irony. Sarah had managed to secure what she believed was preferential treatment through sheer force of personality and social positioning, never realizing that every prestige client received the same meticulous attention to detail. Our reputation had been built on the principle that excellence should be standard rather than exceptional, that every family deserved to have their memories captured with the same care we'd provide for celebrities or politicians. "Everything is prepared according to our usual standards," I replied, watching the real-time booking system update across my laptop screen. "The Pembroke party of 4, scheduled for 1,400 hours, premium package with multiple backdrop options and professional retouching. Has the client made any special requests beyond the standard service menu?" Marcus paused, and I could hear him flipping through his session notes. The primary contact, Sarah Pembroke, emphasized that this is an anniversary celebration and requested our most flattering lighting setup. She also specifically mentioned that family dynamics might be complicated and asked that we focus on the immediate family unit rather than extended relatives. I got the impression there might be some family tension we should be aware of. Family tension. The clinical phrase couldn't capture the years of systematic exclusion and emotional manipulation that had led to this moment. Sarah had reduced decades of relationship building and family investment to a potential complication that might affect her photo session experience. She'd warned the photographer about family tension while creating the very conflict she was trying to avoid. "I'm sure you'll handle whatever dynamics arise with your usual professionalism," I said, meaning it completely. Marcus had photographed senators' families during custody disputes, celebrity couples on the verge of divorce, and multi-generational business dynasties where succession battles were playing out in real time. He'd learned to capture authentic family connection even when that connection was strained or artificial. Of course, I did want to mention that the client seemed particularly concerned about image control and social media presentation. She asked several questions about our confidentiality policies and made it clear that these photos will be used for public sharing on various platforms. Should I flag this session for extra discretion protocols? The request was revealing in ways Sarah probably hadn't intended. Her concern about confidentiality wasn't about protecting family privacy. It was about controlling the narrative these photos would support. She planned to use these images as public proof of family happiness and social status, visual evidence of the life she'd constructed through careful curation and strategic exclusions. "Standard protocols will be sufficient," I assured Marcus. "Document everything thoroughly, as always, and ensure that the client receives exactly the level of service our reputation promises. If any unusual situations arise during the session, handle them with your best professional judgment and contact me immediately if you need guidance." After ending the call, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by the modest furnishings that had become my camouflage over the years. The contrast between my visible lifestyle and actual resources had been deliberate, a strategic choice that allowed me to observe family dynamics without the complicating factor of known wealth. Sarah had made assumptions about my financial situation based on surface appearances, never questioning why those appearances might be misleading. The psychology of underestimation was fascinating from an analytical perspective. People saw what they expected to see, filtered reality through their own biases and assumptions until the truth became secondary to their preferred narrative. Sarah had decided I was a burden and had spent years collecting evidence to support that conclusion while ignoring contradictory information that didn't fit her predetermined assessment. Military intelligence work had taught me that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked harmless, that true threats frequently came from unexpected directions. Sarah had never considered that I might pose any kind of threat to her family control, because I'd never displayed the obvious markers of power she understood. I hadn't fought back against her subtle exclusions, hadn't demanded recognition for my contributions, hadn't insisted on authority I was entitled to claim. My restraint had been strategic rather than passive, based on long-term thinking rather than immediate gratification. Every slight I'd absorbed, every exclusion I'd accepted, every manipulation I'd endured, had been data points in a larger analysis of Sarah's character and methods. I'd been building a comprehensive understanding of her weaknesses while she'd been building overconfidence in her strengths. The phone buzzed with a text from Emma, sent from Sarah's phone but clearly composed by a 7-year-old mind. "Grandma Margaret, Mommy is getting her hair done and I'm getting mine braided special. I wish you were coming to see how pretty we look. Daddy says maybe next time, but I want you there today." The message was accompanied by a selfie of Emma, making an exaggerated sad face, her natural charm shining through even in a staged expression of disappointment. Children had an instinctive understanding of fairness that adults often lost through socialization and compromise. Emma knew that excluding Grandma Margaret from family photos was wrong, not because she understood the complex dynamics involved, but because she recognized that love shouldn't be conditional or selective. Her disappointment was genuine and uncomplicated, free from the adult rationalizations that allowed injustice to masquerade as reasonableness. He texted back, "You'll look beautiful no matter what, sweetheart. Grandma loves you always." Simple words that carried the weight of unconditional commitment, the kind of love that didn't need to be earned or maintained through compliance with arbitrary conditions. Emma would learn today that some promises were more reliable than others, that some people's love remained constant regardless of external circumstances. The last comment was telling. Despite her confident exclusion of me from the photo session, Sarah was concerned enough about potential disruptions to ask about policies regarding uninvited family members. Some part of her understood that her treatment of me had been questionable, and she was trying to protect against consequences she couldn't quite articulate but instinctively feared. "Has she mentioned any specific family members she's concerned about?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. Sarah's anxiety about unexpected arrivals was focused entirely on the possibility that I might somehow disrupt her carefully orchestrated family narrative. She'd excluded me from the session, but couldn't shake the worry that exclusion might not be enforceable if I chose to challenge it. She mentioned her mother-in-law several times, always in the context of potential complications or disruptions. She seems to view this session as particularly important for their family image and wants to ensure that nothing interferes with achieving the results she has in mind. Marcus's professional training kept his tone neutral, but I could hear his puzzlement at the unusual level of anxiety Sarah was displaying about what should have been a straightforward family portrait session. The irony was delicious. Sarah had arrived at my flagship studio, prepared to pay premium prices for services provided by my company, while actively worrying about interference from the woman who owned every piece of equipment being used to create her perfect family images. Her paranoia about my potential presence was preventing her from enjoying the very exclusion she'd worked so hard to achieve. "How is the rest of the family responding to Mrs. Pembroke's approach?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Michael and Emma were handling Sarah's performance of high-maintenance clientele behavior. Michael had never seen his wife interact with service providers in professional settings, and Emma was young enough to find her mother's behavior confusing rather than impressive. Marcus's voice carried a note of sympathy. "The husband seems somewhat embarrassed by his wife's demands, and he's been trying to moderate her interactions with our staff. The little girl is delightful, but appears confused by the tension her mother is creating. She keeps asking when Grandma Margaret is coming, which seems to increase Mrs. Pembroke's stress level significantly." Emma's continued questions about my absence were undermining Sarah's attempt to normalize my exclusion from family events. A 7-year-old's persistent curiosity was more effective at exposing the artificial nature of Sarah's family management than any adult confrontation could have been. Children had an instinctive sense of fairness that made arbitrary exclusions feel wrong, even when they couldn't articulate exactly why. "I'm sure you'll handle the family dynamics with your usual professionalism," I said, meaning it sincerely. Marcus had photographed enough complicated family situations to navigate emotional undercurrents without letting them affect the quality of his work. His ability to create beautiful images despite interpersonal tension was one of the reasons he was assigned to our most challenging client sessions. Of course, I should mention that Mrs. Pembroke asked several questions about studio ownership and management structure. She seemed particularly interested in knowing whether the owners take personal interest in high-profile client sessions. I got the impression she was hoping to meet with senior management to discuss her experience and potentially establish an ongoing relationship for future family events. Sarah's interest in meeting studio ownership was perfectly predictable. She wanted to network her way into the inner circle of what she perceived as an exclusive service provider, hoping to leverage a relationship with prestige management into social capital she could use elsewhere. The strategy was classic Sarah. Identify sources of prestige and work to associate herself with them closely enough to benefit from reflected status. "What did you tell her about meeting with management?" I asked, already knowing that Marcus would have handled the inquiry diplomatically while protecting operational security. Our photographers were trained to deflect requests for owner meetings without creating the impression that such meetings were impossible or that the client's status was insufficient to warrant consideration. I explained that ownership prefers to maintain privacy and typically evaluates client relationships based on long-term patterns rather than individual sessions. I suggested that exceptional service experiences and client satisfaction were the best ways to attract management attention, which seemed to satisfy her immediate concerns while leaving future possibilities open. Perfect. Marcus had given Sarah exactly the kind of response that would encourage her to focus on the photo session itself, rather than pursuing networking opportunities that would have complicated the afternoon's planned revelations. She'd been redirected toward demonstrating her value as a client through cooperation and satisfaction rather than demanding immediate access to decision-makers. "Has the actual photography portion of the session begun yet?" I asked, checking my watch and calculating timing for my own arrival at the studio. The revelation needed to occur at precisely the right moment, after Sarah had committed fully to the session experience, but before the family had completed their time at the studio. "We're just finishing the preliminary consultation and moving into the first setup. Mrs. Pembroke has been very specific about wanting to start with couple shots before moving to full family poses. She mentioned wanting to capture the anniversary theme before including their daughter in the more formal family groupings." The progression was exactly what I'd expected. Sarah would want individual couple photos that could be used for anniversary, announcements and social media posts celebrating her marriage to Michael. Those images would be followed by family portraits that included Emma, creating a complete set of photos that told the story Sarah wanted to preserve and share with her. Social network. "I may stop by the studio later this afternoon to review some operational matters," I said casually, planting the seed for my eventual appearance without making it seem planned or dramatic. "If I happen to arrive while the Pembroke session is in progress, please continue with your normal procedures and don't let my presence disrupt the client experience." Marcus acknowledged the instruction professionally, unaware that he'd just agreed to facilitate one of the most significant family confrontations in recent memory. His focus remained on providing excellent client service, which was exactly the right approach for what was about to unfold. The revelation would be more powerful if it occurred during normal business operations rather than staged as a dramatic intervention. After ending the call, I began my final preparations for the afternoon's events. The drive to the studio would take 20 minutes in current traffic, which meant I needed to leave within the next hour to ensure optimal timing. Sarah's session was scheduled for 2 hours, but her demanding approach to client service suggested it might run longer than originally planned. The outfit I'd chosen was carefully calculated to project quiet authority without obvious displays of wealth or status. A well-tailored blazer in navy blue, the kind of professional attire that suggested competence without demanding attention. Comfortable but elegant shoes that would allow me to move confidently through the studio space. Minimal jewelry that looked expensive without being ostentatious. The overall effect was intended to convey successful professional rather than wealthy entrepreneur. The psychological impact would be maximized if Sarah initially dismissed my appearance as unremarkable before gradually realizing the implications of my presence at the studio. Her assumptions about my financial situation and social status were based on surface observations that had never been tested against contrary evidence. The revelation that those assumptions were fundamentally flawed would be more shocking if it developed organically rather than being announced dramatically. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who'd learned to weaponize underestimation, turning others' biases and assumptions into strategic advantages. The gray streaks in my hair weren't signs of decline, but evidence of experience. The modest styling wasn't about limited resources, but about choosing function over flash. The calm expression wasn't passivity, but confidence earned through decades of overcoming challenges that would have broken less resilient people. Sarah had spent years interpreting my restraint as weakness, my discretion as insignificance, my patience as acceptance of inferior status. She'd constructed an entire narrative about family hierarchy based on superficial observations and wishful thinking. The collision between her assumptions and actual reality was about to provide an education in the difference between apparent power and real authority. The phone buzzed with another text from Emma, this one clearly dictated to Michael since the spelling and grammar were too sophisticated for a 7-year-old. Grandma Margaret, we are at the picture place, and it's really fancy. I told them you should be here too, but Mommy says it's too late to change plans. The man taking pictures is really nice, and he has a big camera like the ones on TV. Emma's description of the studio as really fancy was touching in its innocence. She was experiencing prestige portrait studios the way most clients did, impressed by the professional equipment and elegant setting without understanding the business infrastructure that made such quality possible. The man with the big camera was Marcus, whose technical expertise and artistic skill represented years of investment in training and development. The text continued, "Daddy says we will do something special with just you later, but I want you in the real pictures with everyone. Mommy is being really particular about everything, and it's taking a long time. I hope you can come see how pretty I look in my dress." Michael's promise of a separate photo session, just with me, revealed his complete misunderstanding of what this exclusion actually represented. He thought he could address my hurt feelings with a consolation prize, a secondary photo session that would somehow compensate for being erased from the official family portrait. He didn't understand that the issue wasn't about being photographed, but about being acknowledged as legitimate family. Emma's comment about Sarah being really particular about everything suggested that the session was proceeding exactly as I'd anticipated. Sarah would be micromanaging every aspect of the photography process, trying to control variables she didn't understand while creating stress for everyone involved. Her anxiety about achieving perfect results was probably making the experience less enjoyable for Michael and Emma, undermining the very family harmony she was trying to capture on film. The time had come to leave for the studio. The afternoons. Revelation was about to transform family dynamics in ways that would have permanent consequences for everyone involved. Sarah would learn that power wasn't always visible, that assumptions could be dangerous, and that underestimating people based on surface appearances was a luxury she could no longer afford. Michael would discover that his mother possessed resources and capabilities he'd never bothered to investigate, that his assumptions about my life and status had been fundamentally incorrect. The education would be uncomfortable but necessary, delivered with the love of a parent who refused to accept disrespect disguised as family management. Emma would witness a demonstration of how real family loyalty worked, how genuine love didn't require earned through compliance with arbitrary conditions. She'd learn that Grandma Margaret's absence from family photos wasn't her choice, and that sometimes adults needed to be reminded about fairness and inclusion. The drive to prestige portrait studios felt like approaching a battlefield where victory had already been determined by superior intelligence and strategic positioning. Sarah had chosen the location for this confrontation, selected the timing, and established the stakes. But she'd made those choices without understanding who she was actually fighting or what resources were available to her opponent. The afternoon sun was perfect for photography, creating the kind of natural lighting that would make every subject look their absolute best. Sarah's family photos would be technically flawless, capturing this moment of family dysfunction with crystalline clarity. The irony was that the most memorable part of this photo session wouldn't be the images themselves, but the education that was about to unfold between poses. The parking lot of the Prestige Portrait Studio's flagship location was busier than usual. For a Saturday afternoon, with luxury vehicles occupying most of the spaces closest to the building's elegant entrance. I recognized several of the cars from previous high-profile client sessions. A Mercedes S-Class that belonged to a local news anchor's family, a BMW X7 that I'd seen during a corporate executive's headshot appointment, and a gleaming white Tesla Model X that screamed new money and environmental consciousness in equal measure. Sarah's silver Lexus RX sat in a premium spot near the front door, positioned where it would be visible to anyone entering or leaving the building. Even her parking choices were strategic, designed to associate her family with the other affluent clients who frequented our most exclusive location. She understood instinctively that perception mattered in social positioning, that being seen in the right places with the right people contributed to the narrative she was working to establish about her family's status and success. I chose a space in the back row, between a maintenance van and an older Honda Civic that probably belonged to one of our part-time assistants. The contrast wasn't accidental. I'd learned long ago that the most effective camouflage was often hiding in plain sight, blending into backgrounds where nobody would think to look for anything significant. Sarah would never imagine that the woman driving the modest 10-year-old hadn't had any connection to the premium photography business she was currently patronizing. The walk across the parking lot gave me time to observe the studio's exterior with fresh eyes, seeing it as Sarah would have seen it during her initial approach. The building's architecture was deliberately impressive without being ostentatious, conveying professional success and artistic sophistication through clean lines and understated elegance. Landscape lighting highlighted architectural features, even during daylight hours, while carefully maintained gardens created an atmosphere of refined luxury. The exterior signage was subtle but unmistakable, brushed steel letters spelling Prestige Portrait Studios in a font that suggested both tradition and modernity. Smaller text below identified this as the flagship location and listed our hours of operation, though most of our premium clients scheduled appointments well outside normal business hours to ensure privacy and personalized attention. Sarah would have appreciated these details, recognizing them as markers of exclusivity and professional distinction. Through the large windows that flanked the entrance, I could see into the main reception area where Sarah's family was likely completing their consultation process with Marcus. The interior design was warm but sophisticated, featuring comfortable seating areas, carefully curated artwork, and subtle lighting that made everyone look more attractive than they typically appeared under harsh commercial illumination. The space was designed to make clients feel special and important, to justify the premium pricing we charged for services that were genuinely superior to our competitors' offerings. A young couple emerged from the building as I approached, carrying a leather portfolio that contained preview images from their engagement session. They were discussing dinner plans and seemed relaxed and happy, the kind of satisfied clients who would return for wedding photos and eventually family portraits as their relationship evolved. Their positive experience was exactly what we worked to create for every client, regardless of their social status or spending level. The reception area was busier than I'd expected, with 3 separate client consultations taking place simultaneously in different corners of the main space. Our weekend scheduling had reached capacity months ago, a reflection of Prestige's reputation for delivering results that exceeded expectations. The success was gratifying on both business and personal levels, proof that excellence in service, delivery could create sustainable competitive advantages in even the most saturated markets. Behind the reception desk, Jennifer Martinez was managing multiple client interactions with the grace and efficiency that had made her our most successful. Client relations coordinator. She'd been with Prestige for 8 years, starting as a part-time receptionist and gradually taking on greater responsibilities as the business expanded. Her promotion to senior management had been based on performance rather than tenure, a reflection of the merit-based culture I'd worked to establish throughout the organization. Jennifer looked up as I entered, her professional smile shifting to genuine warmth when she recognized me. "Mrs. Patterson, I didn't expect to see you here today. Are you checking on the Chen session?" Her voice was low enough not to carry to nearby clients, but I appreciated her discretion in not making my presence more obvious than necessary. "Just dropping by to review some operational matters," I replied casually, maintaining the fiction that this was an unplanned visit rather than a carefully timed intervention. "How has the afternoon been progressing? Any issues I should be aware of?" Jennifer's expression shifted subtly, suggesting that there had indeed been complications worth discussing. "The Pembroke session has been interesting. Mrs. Pembroke has very specific expectations and hasn't been shy about expressing them. Marcus is handling it professionally, but it's definitely been more challenging than our typical family portrait appointment." The diplomatic language couldn't quite disguise Jennifer's opinion of Sarah's behavior during the first hour of what was supposed to be a relaxed, enjoyable family experience. Our staff was trained to accommodate demanding clients without compromising service quality, but there were limits to how much disruption could be managed before it began affecting other operations. "Where are they currently in the session process?" I asked, calculating timing for my eventual appearance in the studio space. The revelation needed to occur when it would have maximum impact while still allowing the session to be completed successfully. For Emma's sake. My granddaughter deserved beautiful family photos, even if the family dynamics captured in those images were more complex than they appeared. They're about halfway through the planned setups. Marcus started with some couple portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Pembroke, then moved to individual shots with their daughter. They're currently working on full family groupings, though Mrs. Pembroke keeps requesting adjustments to poses and lighting that are extending the timeline significantly. The progression matched my expectations perfectly. Sarah would have wanted the couple shots for anniversary announcements and social media posts, individual photos of Emma for grandparent gifts and school displays, and family portraits that could serve as the official record of their current family composition. Each category served specific purposes in the broader narrative Sarah was constructing about her family's success and happiness. "Has Mrs. Pembroke mentioned anything about family members who aren't present for the session?" I asked, curious about whether Sarah's anxiety about my potential interference had continued throughout the afternoon. Her paranoia about unexpected disruptions had been evident during Marcus's earlier phone call, and stress often intensified rather than diminished during complicated social situations. Jennifer's smile became slightly strained. She's mentioned her mother-in-law several times, usually in the context of how much simpler family events are when they don't have to accommodate extended family preferences. She seems very focused on maintaining control over the session parameters, and has asked repeatedly about our policies regarding people who might arrive without appointments. The irony was becoming more delicious by the minute. Sarah was paying premium prices to use my studio while actively celebrating my exclusion from the family event she was documenting. Her relief at not having to accommodate extended family preferences was being expressed to employees of the company I owned, in the building I'd designed, using equipment I'd personally selected and approved. I think I'll observe the session briefly to ensure everything is proceeding smoothly, I said, keeping my tone casual and professional. Please don't announce my presence unless there are specific issues that require owner intervention. I'd prefer to maintain a low profile while I assess the situation. Jennifer nodded understandingly, accustomed to my preference for discreet oversight rather than dramatic management interventions. The request wasn't unusual. I'd observed numerous client sessions over the years to ensure service quality and identify opportunities for operational improvement. From her perspective, this was standard business practice rather than personal family drama about to unfold. The corridor leading to Studio A was lined with sample portraits that showcased the range and quality of work prestige photographers produced for clients across various demographics and social situations. Wedding photos, corporate headshots, family portraits, senior pictures, each image carefully selected to demonstrate technical excellence and artistic vision. Sarah would have seen these examples during her initial consultation, using them to calibrate her expectations for her own family's session. The soundproofing between studios was excellent, designed to ensure that clients in one space wouldn't be disturbed by activities in adjacent areas. But as I approached Studio A, I could hear Sarah's voice carrying through the partially open door, her tone sharp with frustration, despite Marcus's patient professional responses. The conversation suggested that the session was becoming more stressful rather than more enjoyable as it progressed. I specifically asked for softer lighting on my left side, Sarah was saying, her voice tight with the kind of controlled irritation that indicated deeper frustration. The shadows are too harsh in these shots, and they're not going to work for the anniversary announcement we're planning. Can't you adjust the equipment to create more flattering results? Marcus's response was diplomatically patient. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Pembroke. The lighting setup we're using is specifically designed to minimize shadows while maintaining natural-looking illumination. Would you like to see the preview images on the monitor so we can discuss specific adjustments that might better meet your expectations? The exchange revealed everything about the dynamic that had been developing throughout the session. Sarah was micromanaging technical aspects she didn't understand, while Marcus was trying to deliver professional results, despite client interference that was making his job significantly more difficult. Her anxiety about controlling every variable was preventing her from trusting the expertise she was paying premium prices to access. Emma, sweetheart, stand up straighter and smile like you mean it, Sarah continued, her voice now directed at my granddaughter. These pictures are going to be seen by a lot of people, and we want to make sure you look your absolute best. Remember, what we practiced at home about keeping your chin up and your shoulders back. The instruction to Emma was heartbreaking in its implications. Sarah was treating a 7-year-old's natural poses and expressions as inadequate, imposing adult standards of performance on a child who should have been enjoying a fun family activity. The practice at home suggested that this photo session had been preceded by coaching designed to ensure Emma's appearance met Sarah's exacting standards. Mommy, I am smiling, Emma replied, her voice carrying the confusion of a child who was trying her best to please but couldn't understand why her natural expressions weren't good enough. Can we ask Grandma Margaret to come now? I want her to see my pretty dress and how good I'm being for the pictures. Sarah's response was swift and sharp. Emma, we've already discussed this. Grandma Margaret isn't coming to this photo session. We're creating special pictures of just our immediate family, and that means Mommy, Daddy, and you. We can take different pictures with Grandma Margaret another time. The clinical explanation of immediate family was delivered with the kind of false patience adults used when they wanted to end conversations children were trying to continue. Sarah was using definitional authority to justify emotional cruelty, hiding behind technical terminology to avoid acknowledging the arbitrary nature of her exclusion decision. Michael's voice joined the conversation, though his tone suggested embarrassment rather than support. Sarah, maybe we could include Mom in just a few shots at the end. Emma really wants her grandmother in some of the family pictures, and it might make the whole experience more enjoyable for everyone. His suggestion was tentative rather than insistent, revealing the family dynamic that had allowed Sarah to gradually assume control over social decisions through persistent pressure and emotional manipulation. Michael wasn't comfortable with excluding me from family photos, but he wasn't willing to confront his wife's determination to maintain that exclusion either. "Michael, we've already paid for a specific package and planned specific poses," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the exasperation of someone who felt her carefully laid plans were being undermined by unreasonable requests. Adding more people at this point would completely change the composition and timing we've arranged with the photographer. Besides, your mother said she was fine with not being included. The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that it was almost impressive. Sarah had transformed my strategic non-resistance into enthusiastic acceptance, creating a narrative where I'd voluntarily chosen exclusion rather than having it imposed upon me. The revision of recent history was so complete that she might have actually convinced herself it was true. This was the perfect moment for my entrance. Sarah had just lied about my reaction to being excluded, created false justification for maintaining that exclusion, and dismissed Emma's legitimate desire to include her grandmother in family photos. The convergence of dishonesty, manipulation, and cruelty provided the ideal educational opportunity I'd been waiting for. I stepped into the studio doorway, my presence immediately visible to everyone in the room, but my entrance subtle enough to avoid creating unnecessary drama. The studio lighting illuminated my face clearly, ensuring there would be no question about my identity or the implications of my unexpected appearance. "Hello, everyone," I said calmly, my voice carrying the quiet authority that had served me well in military briefings and business presentations. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The silence that followed my entrance was so complete, it felt like the studio's soundproofing had suddenly become perfect. Sarah's face went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as she began to process the implications of my presence in what she'd assumed was neutral territory. Marcus paused mid-adjustment of his camera settings, professional enough not to react dramatically, but clearly sensing that the family dynamics had just shifted in ways he didn't fully understand. Emma broke the silence first, her 7-year-old, voice cutting through the tension with pure joy. "Grandma Margaret, you came! I knew you would come see how pretty I look." She started to move toward me, but Sarah's hand on her shoulder stopped her momentum. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice artificially bright with the kind of forced pleasantness people used when they were caught off guard but trying to maintain social control. "What a surprise. I thought you were busy with other things today. We're in the middle of our family photo session, as you can see." The emphasis on our family photo session was deliberate, a verbal boundary designed to remind me that I wasn't welcome in this space or this moment. Sarah was trying to reassert her authority over the situation by reinforcing the exclusion that had brought me here in the first place. But her voice carried an undertone of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, suggesting she was beginning to question her assumptions about power dynamics. Michael stood up from his posed position, his face showing the embarrassment of a man who realized his family drama was playing out in front of professional strangers. "Mom, what are you doing here? I thought you said you understood about the photo thing." His use of Sarah's dismissive language revealed how thoroughly he'd adopted her framing of the situation, reducing my legitimate hurt to a minor inconvenience that reasonable people should simply accept. "I am here," I said calmly, "because this is my studio." The words hung in the air like a revelation that rewrote everything everyone thought they knew about the afternoon's events. Sarah's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Michael's expression shifted from embarrassment to confusion, his brain clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he'd assumed about his mother's life and circumstances. Marcus, to his credit, maintained his professional demeanor, while his eyes flicked between me and his clients, beginning to understand why Mrs. Patterson had chosen to observe this particular session so closely. His military background had taught him to adapt quickly to changing situations, and He was already calculating how to navigate this family revelation while still completing his professional responsibilities. Your studio? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling in real time. That's impossible. You can't. We researched this place extensively. Prestige Portrait Studios is owned by... She trailed off, realizing she'd never actually investigated ownership details beyond confirming the company's reputation and pricing structure. Prestige Portrait Studios is owned by Patterson Holdings, LLC, I continued, my voice maintaining the same calm tone I'd use for any business discussion. Which I established 23 years ago when I opened our first location in a strip mall downtown. We now operate 27 studios across 3 states, with annual revenue approaching $40 million. This flagship location, where you're currently paying premium prices to exclude me from family photos, was my personal design project. Emma was looking back and forth between the adults, her child's intuition telling her that something monumentally important was happening even though she couldn't understand the details. Grandma Margaret, does this mean you work here? Is that why you know so much about taking pictures? Grandma Margaret owns here, sweetheart, I said gently, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. Every camera, every light, every beautiful backdrop you see was chosen by me to help families create wonderful memories together. I built this place because I believe family pictures should include everyone who loves you. The implication was clear, and Sarah understood it perfectly. She'd spent the afternoon celebrating my exclusion from family photos in a business I'd built from nothing, using equipment I'd selected, in a studio I'd designed, served by staff I'd hired and trained. The irony was so complete it bordered on cosmic justice. This changes nothing, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she tried to reassert control over a situation that had moved completely beyond her management. Family photos are still a private family decision, regardless of where they're taken. Property ownership doesn't equal automatic inclusion in personal family moments. It was a reasonable argument from someone who didn't understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. Sarah was trying to separate business ownership from family relationships, maintaining that my professional success didn't give me rights to family inclusion. The logic was sound but irrelevant, because she was still missing the larger point about power, respect, and consequences. You're absolutely right, I agreed, standing back up to my full height. Family inclusion should be based on love, loyalty, and mutual respect rather than financial leverage. But exclusion based on arbitrary power plays and social manipulation? That has consequences. I turned to Marcus, who had been watching this family drama unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing a masterclass in interpersonal dynamics. Marcus, I'd like you to continue the session exactly as planned. Mrs. Pembroke has paid for premium service, and she should receive exactly what she purchased. However, I'd like to add some additional family groupings to today's shoot, Marcus nodded professionally. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. How would you like to modify the session parameters? I'd like some photos of Emma and me together, and some multi-generational shots that include all the adults. Mrs. Pembroke can certainly have her immediate family portraits as originally planned, but I think Emma deserves to have pictures with her grandmother as well. These photos will be part of Emma's childhood memories, and those memories should be complete. Sarah's face flushed with anger and humiliation. You can't just insert yourself into our family session because you own the building. This is manipulation and abuse of business power, and I won't stand for it. Actually, I said, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. What you won't stand for is irrelevant. You've spent 2 years systematically excluding me from family events, dismissing my contributions, and treating me like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a family member to be respected. You've lied to my son about my reactions, manipulated my granddaughter's understanding of family relationships, and made family membership conditional on your approval. The litany of Sarah's offenses was delivered without emotion, each point stated as factual observation rather than angry accusation. The clinical approach made the indictment more powerful rather than less, suggesting comprehensive documentation rather than momentary frustration. Today, you chose to exclude me from family photos while paying premium prices to use my business, served by my employees, in my studio. You celebrated my absence while benefiting from my success. That level of disrespect requires correction. Michael finally found his voice, though it carried the uncertainty of someone who realized he'd fundamentally misunderstood the situation he was in. Mom, I had no idea about any of this. Why didn't you tell me about your business? Why did you let us think you were struggling financially? Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer except love and family loyalty, I replied, looking directly at my son. The answer was disappointing but informative. You chose a wife who treats family like a social hierarchy to be managed, and you supported her decisions without questioning whether they were right or kind. The truth was harsh, but necessary. Michael needed to understand that his complicity in Sarah's behavior had consequences, that enabling cruelty through passivity was still a choice with moral implications. I think, I continued, that Emma and I should have some special grandmother-granddaughter photos to commemorate this educational afternoon. Sarah, you're welcome to be included in family shots if you can manage to behave respectfully for the remainder of the session. If not, you're welcome to leave while we complete the photos that should have been planned from the beginning. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Sarah was no longer controlling family inclusion. She was being offered conditional participation based on her ability to demonstrate basic courtesy. The reversal was total and unmistakable. Emma clapped, her hands together, her delight undiminished by the adult tensions swirling around her. Yes. Pictures with Grandma Margaret. Can we do the one where we're both laughing? And can you tell Marcus about the funny faces we make when nobody's looking? The innocence and joy in Emma's response highlighted everything that had been wrong with Sarah's approach to family management. Children understood instinctively that love should be inclusive rather than exclusive, that family photos should celebrate connection rather than demonstrate control. Marcus stepped forward diplomatically. Why don't we take a short break to reset? The lighting for multi-generational portraits? Mrs. Patterson, would you like to review the shots we've already captured while I make the technical adjustments? The next hour proceeded smoothly, with Sarah maintaining sullen cooperation while beautiful photos were created that included every family member. Emma's joy was infectious, and even Michael began to relax as he watched his daughter and mother interact naturally in front of the camera. The photos would capture not just faces and poses, but the authentic family relationships that Sarah had tried so hard to control and manipulate. As the session concluded, Sarah gathered her purse with stiff dignity, clearly planning a swift exit from a situation that had humiliated her more thoroughly than she'd thought possible. But I wasn't quite finished with her education. Sarah, I said as she headed for the door, I'll be sending you an invoice for today's session modifications, along with a detailed explanation of Prestige Portrait Studio's family inclusion policies. In the future, I'd suggest researching the ownership structure of businesses before you use them to celebrate excluding family members. It can lead to awkward situations. She left without responding, her silence more eloquent than any argument could have been. Michael lingered, clearly struggling with revelations that had reframed his understanding of family dynamics and his own role in perpetuating harmful patterns. Mom, I owe you a huge apology. I had no idea how successful you'd become or how badly Sarah had been treating you. I should have paid better attention to what was really happening. The business success isn't the point, Michael, I replied. The point is that you have a daughter who deserves to grow up understanding that family love should be unconditional and inclusive. Today, Emma learned that Grandma Margaret will always show up for her, regardless of what other adults decide. Is convenient or socially acceptable. Emma hugged me tightly as we prepared to leave, her small arms conveying more genuine affection than I'd felt from adult family members in years. "Grandma Margaret, will you be in all our family pictures from now on? If you want me there, sweetheart, I'll be there," I promised, meaning it completely. As we walked out of the studio together, Emma chattering happily about the photos we'd just taken, I reflected on the afternoon's lessons about power, respect, and family loyalty. Sarah had learned that underestimating people based on appearances could be expensive and embarrassing. Michael had learned that passive enabling of cruelty carried moral consequences. And Emma had learned that real family love didn't require permission from anyone. The photos from that session now hang in frames throughout my cottage, beautiful images that capture a moment when truth prevailed over manipulation, when hidden strength emerged to correct injustice, and when a 7-year-old's understanding of family proved more sophisticated than her parents' social maneuvering. Sometimes the most powerful response to exclusion isn't anger or argument, but simply showing up with the resources to rewrite the rules entirely. So there you have it, folks. Sometimes being underestimated isn't a weakness, it's a strategic advantage. Sarah learned that day that quiet strength often beats loud manipulation, and that real power doesn't need to announce itself until it's time to make a point. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story? Drop a comment below and share your experience. And if you enjoyed this story of family justice and hidden success, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our tales of people who turned being overlooked into their greatest advantage. Remember, the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who look harmless, until they don't.